You probably grew up with the sanitized animated versions of Cinderella or Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, the colorful dresses, the singing animals, and those perfectly orchestrated happy endings that just wrap up so neatly in 90 minutes.
Right, the classic fairy tale package.
Exactly. But what if the original versions of these stories featured, like, rampant cannibalism or red-hot iron shoes used for torture?
Yeah, or biological mothers demanding to eat their own children's lungs and liver.
It's honestly mind-blowing, and that's exactly what we're looking at today, because I spent the weekend just pouring through the stack of sources we compiled for this deep dive, and I was completely blown away by the sheer brutality.
Oh, it's a completely jarring contrast. I mean, we have this deep collective cultural memory of fairy tales functioning as something inherently safe, right?
Mhm.
Like a soft, moralistic blanket to tuck children into bed with.
Right.
But when you actually dive into the raw source material from the early 19th century, it is anything but safe. The earliest iterations of these tales operate on a fundamentally different and much darker psychological wavelength.
It is the absolute definition of a nightmare. I mean,
Right.
we are talking about characters being shoved into barrels studded with inward-pointing nails and literally rolled down cobblestone streets.
It completely upends the modern perception of these narratives.
It really does. Which brings us to our core mission for this deep dive. We are taking a massive array of research, and I mean, we are spanning historical linguistic texts, deep literary criticism, all the way to modern intellectual property development notes from Hollywood studios.
Which is such a fascinating jump, by the way.
Oh, it's wild. But we're using all of this to uncover the real Brothers Grimm. We want to reveal how two intensely serious academic linguists who were desperate to unify a shattered, fragmented Germany accidentally codified the master blueprint for modern fantasy.
And in doing so, they waged this silent, generational ideological war between ancient paganism and 19th century Christian morality.
So to really grasp the mechanics of that ideological war, I feel like we have to completely discard the pop culture image of the Grimms.
Oh, absolutely. You have to throw that right out the window.
Mhm.
We aren't talking about, kindly old grandpas sitting in a rustic, snow-covered cabin smoking pipes and spinning yarns for the local village kids.
Yeah, no grandfatherly vibes here at all.
None. To understand them, we have to examine who Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm actually were, the extreme traumas of their early life, and the politically fractured world that forced them to seek out these stories in the first place.
Then let's unpack that actual biography right now, because it is surprisingly intense. We're looking at two brothers born in 1785 and 1786 in Hanau.
Which was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time.
Right, and from what the historical records show, they didn't start out collecting stories at all. They basically started out just fighting for basic survival.
Yeah, though it didn't start that way. Their early childhood was actually quite privileged.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, their father, Philip Wilhelm Grimm, was a very prominent jurist. He was a district magistrate. So for the first decade of their lives in this countryside town of Steinau, they lived in a very large, comfortable home. They had servants.
Okay, so a very upper middle class upbringing.
Exactly. But that foundational stability just collapsed overnight. In 1796, their father died suddenly of pneumonia.
Wow.
Yeah, Jacob was 11 and Wilhelm was only 10.
Oh my gosh. Which means these two oldest boys are suddenly thrust into the role of providers for a massive family.
Right.
The sources describe their mother having to immediately abandon the estate, dismiss all the servants, and basically rely entirely on the charity of their aunt and grandfather just to feed the kids.
It's a total psychological freefall. They go from comfort and status straight into severe poverty.
That has to leave a mark.
Oh, a massive one.
Yeah.
And the grandfather's primary advice to the boys during this whole crisis was essentially, put your heads down and be ruthlessly industrious.
Work your way out of it.
Precisely. And they absorbed that lesson completely. They developed this ferocious work ethic, and it was driven by pure necessity and just the absolute fear of destitution.
Right, because the safety net is gone.
It's completely gone. And when they were sent away to school in Kassel and later to the University of Marburg to study law, they were acutely aware of their degraded social status.
Because they're the poor kids now.
Exactly. They were excluded from the social clubs, they were denied the stipends that were just handed out to wealthier students, and they were basically ostracized by the high-born aristocracy.
So they isolate themselves and they just channel every ounce of that alienation into their studies?
Yeah, they essentially lived in the library.
But they aren't studying like creative writing or theatrical storytelling. The sources make it clear they are studying law, medieval literature, and primarily linguistics. They were hardcore philologists.
They were linguistic scientists. That's the
Yeah.
crucial thing to remember. Jacob Grimm is actually a foundational figure in comparative linguistics. Yeah. There is a deeply important phonetic principle that is still taught today in linguistics classes, and it's literally named Grimm's Law.
Okay, I want to pause on Grimm's Law right here because the sources mention it, but I think for the listener, we need to really understand what this actually means. What did Jacob Grimm figure out that was so groundbreaking?
Okay, so think of it as mapping the DNA of human language.
Okay.
Jacob Grimm meticulously tracked how specific consonant sounds systematically shifted as ancient Proto-Indo-European evolved into the various Germanic languages over centuries.
Wait, he tracked the consonants?
Yes. He proved, mathematically and structurally, that these phonetic changes weren't just random drift. For example, he showed how the P sound in Latin words like pater or pez consistently shifted to an F sound in Germanic languages.
So Pater becomes father.
Exactly, and P's becomes foot.
Oh, wow. So he's basically reverse engineering the evolutionary tree of language. He's tracking the mutations to find a common ancestor.
That is a perfect way to put it. He was proving that language has a governed scientific architecture. So when the brothers eventually turned their attention to folktales, they didn't do it because they wanted to entertain anyone.
Right.
They approached these stories as data sets. They believed that just as you can trace the phonetic shift of a consonant back to an ancient civilization, you could trace the narrative structure of a peasant story back to an original, pure Germanic mythology.
But something specific had to trigger that pivot, right? Because you don't just jump from mapping consonants to interviewing people about talking wolves without a major external catalyst.
You don't.
And looking at the timeline, the catalyst is entirely political. It's 1806, and Napoleon Bonaparte marches in and officially dissolves the Holy Roman Empire.
Right. And the psychological impact of 1806 on the German psyche, it just cannot be overstated. Napoleon's conquest left behind a shattered mosaic of dozens of fragmented German principalities and duchies.
So there isn't even a country anymore.
No, there was no unified political entity called Germany. And in the wake of this humiliation, with French troops literally occupying their cities and French culture being imposed on their institutions, there was this massive intellectual counter-movement.
Which our sources refer to as romantic nationalism. Let's break that down for the listener, because romantic in this context doesn't mean like love stories.
No, not at all.
It's about building a nation through shared emotion and myth. Right?
Exactly. The intellectuals of the era, who were heavily influenced by philosophers like Johann Gottfried Herder, they believed that the borders of a true nation weren't drawn by politicians on a map.
Right.
A true nation was defined by its Volk, the common people, and their shared language, history, and organic culture. Herder actually coined the term Volkspoesie, which means the natural poetry of the people.
The poetry of the people. So meaning the uncorrupted soul of the nation isn't found in the palaces or the, French-speaking aristocratic salons.
Exactly.
It's found in the dirt. It's found in the oral traditions of the peasants working the fields.
And the Grimms just latched onto this philosophy with pure academic fervor. They really believed that if you strip away the French literary influence and you dig down into the raw oral traditions of the German countryside, you will find the remnants of ancient pre-Christian Teutonic myths.
They thought these stories were ancient religion.
Yes. They viewed these folk tales as shattered fragments of a lost national religion. By gathering and comparing different regional variants of a single tale, they thought they could piece the broken stained glass window back together and reveal the pure German soul.
So they are essentially 19th century data scientists trying to reconstruct a unified national identity from local gossip.
That's entirely what they were doing.
But here is where I see a massive contradiction in the source material, and it's kind of hilarious.
It really is.
The Grimms are obsessed with purity. They want the raw, uncorrupted, rustic German peasant voice to fight off this French cultural invasion. But if you look at who their primary informants actually were like, the people actually sitting down and telling them these stories, it wasn't the rural peasantry at all.
No, the historical reality completely undermines their stated methodology. The Grimms cultivated this very romantic image of traveling deep into the dark woods to listen to old peasant women spinning flax.
Right, the classic imagery.
But in reality, their most prolific sources were young, highly educated, middle-class or aristocratic women sitting in very comfortable parlors in the city of Kassel.
And it gets worse for their pure German project. We're talking about women like Marie Hassenpflug and Dorothea Wieman.
Yes.
The sources point out that these women were of French Huguenot descent.
The Huguenot connection is the ultimate irony of the Grimm's entire project.
It's so funny.
The Huguenots were French Protestants who fled religious persecution in the 16th and 17th centuries, and a lot of them settled in Germany. They assimilated over generations, but they brought their deep French cultural heritage with them, including their books.
So it's highly probable, honestly, looking at the sources, it's almost guaranteed that these women were intimately familiar with the highly stylized fairy tales published in Paris by Charles Perrault way back in 1697.
Oh, definitely.
Stories like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Little Red Riding Hood, which Perrault literally wrote for the amusement of King Louis XIV's aristocratic court.
Exactly. The oral tradition the Grimms were treating as pure pre-Christian German mythology was actually already deeply contaminated by French aristocratic literature.
It completely defeats the purpose.
It does. The Grimms were meticulously recording stories that they thought were ancient Teutonic myths, completely unaware that their informants were essentially reciting variations of French courtly entertainment that had just filtered down through the Huguenot diaspora.
It's like a modern ethnomusicologist trying to find authentic, ancient Appalachian folk songs, but interviewing someone whose grandfather was a record executive in London, and they end up just transcribing acoustic covers of the Beatles.
That is a hilarious and incredibly accurate analogy. The methodology was inherently flawed from the very start. But what makes the Grimm's legacy so endlessly fascinating is how they reacted once they began to realize these flaws.
Right.
And more importantly, how they reacted when the public finally read their first collection.
Which brings us to arguably the most defining aspect of their work, the Great Sanitization. The evolution of these texts from their original publication to the final version is just staggering. Let's look at the timeline. The first edition of Kinder- and Hausmärchen Children's and Household Tales is published in 1812.
Right, the 1812 edition.
It contains 86 stories, and despite having the word children's in the title, it was not meant for kids. It was a dense, scholarly treatise aimed at other academics.
The 1812 edition is the closest we have to the raw, unfiltered oral traditions they actually collected. And because it was intended for an academic audience, they didn't hold back. They included the sex, the grotesque violence, and the deep moral ambiguity that characterized peasant storytelling.
The rawness is genuinely shocking. We touched on this in the hook, but let's give the listener the specific details here. In the original 1812 version of Rapunzel, she doesn't just, sing in the tower waiting for rescue.
No, she doesn't.
The prince visits her multiple times, and eventually Rapunzel innocently asks the witch, Mother Gothel, why her clothes are suddenly getting so tight around her belly. She is literally pregnant out of wedlock in the tower.
And that detail reflects the realities of the adult world these stories originated in. You see similar harsh realities in the original Snow White.
Oh, the Snow White one is crazy.
Right. In 1812, there is no wicked stepmother. The villain is Snow White's biological mother.
Which changes everything.
It really does. She becomes insanely jealous of her own daughter's ballooning sexuality and beauty, and she orders the huntsman to drag her own child into the woods, murder her, and bring back her lungs and liver to be cooked and eaten.
Biological mothers ordering hits on their children, unmarried pregnancies, and the violence. You look at a story like The Goose Girl, where the false bride is punished at the end by being stripped naked, shoved into a wooden barrel completely lined with sharp inward-pointing iron nails, and dragged through the cobblestone streets by 2 white horses until she bleeds to death.
I know, it's incredibly visceral. But these are narratives designed by adults, for adults, to process a world where life was incredibly cheap, famine was a regular occurrence, and justice was often brutal and absolute.
Right, it reflects their actual environment.
Exactly. But the 1812 edition hit the German literary market and was met with significant backlash. Critics, particularly those from the educated bourgeois class, were horrified.
I bet.
They argued that if a book has the word children's in the title, it probably shouldn't feature premarital sex and maternal infanticide.
That makes sense. So the Grimms have a choice to make. Do they stick to their guns as serious philologists and preserve the scientific data, or do they adapt?
And this is the turning point.
This is where Wilhelm Grimm steps up and fundamentally changes the trajectory of world literature.
Right.
By the time they released the small edition in 1825, which was specifically curated for families, and all the way up to the final massive 7th edition in 1857, Wilhelm has taken over the primary editing duties. And he goes to work. He essentially becomes a crisis PR manager, trying to rebrand a gritty underground horror show for a mainstream family audience.
That's exactly what he did. Wilhelm's editorial interventions were aggressive and systematic. He shifted the entire goal of the project from scholarly preservation to commercial viability and moral instruction.
He wanted it to sell.
He wanted it to sell, and he wanted the book to be a manual for bourgeois German manners. First, he scrubbed every single reference to premarital sex or pregnancy. So Rapunzel no longer asks why her clothes are tight.
Right.
She simply comments that the witch is heavier to pull up than the prince. The pregnancy is erased entirely.
But the violence stays. That's the wild part. In fact, in some cases, the sources show the violence actually gets more descriptive in later editions. Why edit out the sex but keep the torture barrels?
Well, you have to understand the 19th century bourgeois mindset. They viewed sex as a corruption of innocence, something to be strictly hidden from children.
Okay.
But violence was an extremely useful pedagogical tool.
Wait, really?
Yes. Wilhelm utilized violence as a mechanism for didactic justice. If a character disobeys, or is wicked, their brutal punishment serves as a terrifying deterrent for misbehaving children. The violence was retained because it taught discipline.
So the moral architecture is completely reshaped. And that brings us to the most famous edit of all, the stepmothers.
Ah, yes.
Wilhelm goes through the manuscript and systematically changes almost all the murderous biological mothers into wicked stepmothers. We see it in Snow White. We see it in Hansel and Gretel. Why? What is the psychological function of that specific change?
It was done explicitly to protect the cultural sanctity of motherhood.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, particularly within the German cult of true womanhood, the biological mother was the absolute moral center of the family. She was meant to be entirely selfless, nurturing, and pure.
Right.
To present a story where a German mother tries to murder and cannibalize her own child was not just disturbing, it threatened the foundational bedrock of society. By displacing that evil onto an outsider, a stepmother who is inherently a rival for the family's resources, Wilhelm protected the idealized image of the biological mother.
And he's also systematically altering the vocabulary while he does this, isn't he?
Yeah.
We talked about the French Huguenot informants earlier. Wilhelm realizes the text is literally littered with French loan words, so he initiates a linguistic purge to make it sound more authentically German.
Yes. Every word of French origin was painstakingly hunted down and replaced.
Wow.
For example, the French word fille, which means fairy, was scrubbed and replaced with the Teutonic phrase wise Frau or wise woman. A prince became a Königssohn, a king's son. He was artificially engineering a rustic German tone that the original informants never actually used.
I mean, I have to push back hard on the Grimms here, because if we follow this logic to its conclusion, it completely destroys their credibility as scientists.
It certainly challenges it.
If Wilhelm is deleting the sex, ramping up the moralistic violence, changing the core family dynamics to protect 19th century sensibilities, and artificially altering the vocabulary to hide the French influence, he isn't collecting folklore anymore. He is actively manufacturing fake lore. He is corrupting the very data he claims to be preserving. How do they justify this?
Folklorists have debated that exact ethical breach for a century.
I can imagine.
The Grimms publicly maintained the facade that they were faithful recorders of a pure oral tradition. But privately, Wilhelm believed he wasn't changing the stories. He believed he was restoring them.
Oh, come on.
I know, but he felt that the peasant informants had degraded the tales over time, and that by adding moral cohesion and poetic flair, he was elevating the stories back to their lost mythic state.
That is an incredible level of academic hubris, to look at raw data and say, the data is wrong, I'm going to fix it so it matches my hypothesis.
It is hubris, absolutely. But the profound result of that hubris is that Wilhelm essentially codified a completely new grammar of the fairy tale. By merging ancient peasant motifs with 19th century bourgeois values, he built the stylistic format for how the modern world recognizes a fairy tale.
Okay, to truly see this mechanical editorial process at work and to understand how these stories became battlegrounds between the ancient paganism they were looking for and the modern Christianity they wanted to promote, we need to dive into a specific case study.
Let's do it.
Let's look at a story the listener knows as Sleeping Beauty. In the Grimm's collection, it is titled Briar Rose.
Briar Rose serves as the perfect laboratory to observe this ideological syncretism, the deliberate blending of two highly distinct belief systems into one coherent narrative.
Right.
The brothers were convinced this tale had deep Teutonic roots. They connected it to the myth of Brynhild from the ancient Norse Eddas, where a Valkyrie maiden is punished by Odin, put into an enchanted sleep, and surrounded by a ring of hellfire until a hero rescues her.
So let's trace how Wilhelm engineered the text between the 1812 edition and the 1857 edition to amplify those pagan elements while simultaneously injecting his own values. The opening scene is a great example.
Yeah.
In 1812, the queen is bathing, and a crab crawls out of the water to prophesy that she will finally have a daughter. But by 1857, Wilhelm has deleted the crab and replaced it with a frog. Why a frog? What does that change mechanically?
Well, a crab is generally a static symbol, often associated with French variations. But in deep Germanic folklore, the frog is an incredibly potent symbol of fertility, liminality, and transformation.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it. A frog begins its life as an aquatic tadpole and morphed into a terrestrial creature. Placing a frog in the scene signals to the reader there are profound, boundary-crossing magical transformations are about to occur.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, the queen bathing connects back to pre-Christian midsummer rituals, where natural bodies of water were viewed as direct conduits for spiritual rebirth and granting boons.
So he's actively layering the pagan aesthetic back in, and this is most obvious with the fairies. As we noted, Wilhelm erased the French fairies and replaced them with wise Frauen, or wise women. But looking at the source analysis, this is far more than just a find and replace vocabulary swap. It shifts the entire cosmological weight of the story.
Exactly, because when you invoke the wise Frauen in Teutonic mythology, you are directly invoking the Norns.
The Norns.
Yes, the Norns are the Germanic and Norse equivalents of the Fates. They are powerful, ancient entities who sit at the base of the world tree, Yggdrasil. Their specific cosmic function is to spin the threads of human destiny on the day a child is born. They measure the length of the thread and they cut it.
Which gives entirely new meaning to the central prop of the story, the spindle.
Exactly.
Briar Rose isn't just pricking her finger on a random sharp object in an attic. The spindle is the literal tool of the Norns. It represents this ancient pagan view of diligent, cosmic womanhood actively shaping human fate.
And the 13th wise woman who curses the princess isn't just a petty, uninvited party guest. She is delivering a decree of fate. In the pagan worldview, fate or weird cannot be undone, negotiated with, or prayed away. It is absolute.
And we see that absolute fate reflected in the environment. After she falls asleep, a massive hedge of thorns grows around the castle. But this isn't just a physical barrier. Look at how the Grimms describe the forest. Many princes try to chop their way through the thorns to reach the sleeping princess before the 100 years are up. But they can't. The thorns literally come alive.
Right.
They cling together as if they had hands, trapping the princes who die miserable, agonizing deaths suspended in the briars.
Because in Teutonic mythology, nature isn't a passive backdrop. Forests are liminal spaces, thresholds, where the mortal world and the supernatural realm overlap and interact. The thorn hedge functions as a magical, sentient gatekeeper. It is responding directly to the timeline of destiny.
It's enforcing the concept of word. When the right prince finally arrives, precisely on the day the 100-year curse expires, he doesn't have to fight his way in. The text says the thorns miraculously turn into beautiful flowers and willingly part to let him walk through unharmed. It's an entirely pagan framework where nature and fate are inextricably linked.
However, superimposed directly on top of this ancient fatalism is Wilhelm's strict 19th century Christian morality.
Right.
The Grimms were devout Protestant Lutherans. They operated under the theological assumption that Christianity hadn't erased Germany's pagan past, but had rather preserved and perfected it.
So they install a Christian moral framework of cause and effect right over the pagan mythology.
Yes.
Let's look at the mechanics of the curse itself. Briar Rose is warned not to interact with spindles, but as a teenager, she disobeys the implicit rules of the castle. She wanders into an old tower, finds the old woman spinning, and touches the spindle. Her disobedience brings a punishment of death.
It structurally mirrors the original sin in the Garden of Eden. Eve disobeys the command, touches the forbidden fruit, and brings death into the world.
Wow, yes.
The connection is made even more explicit by the environment. What grows around the castle after she falls? Thorns. In the book of Genesis, God's specific curse upon the earth after the fall of man is, "Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you."
That is a brilliant connection. And yet, there is the 12th wise woman, She arrives late to the feast, right? She can't fully undo the curse of the 13th, but she uses her power to mitigate the punishment from death to a 100-year sleep.
Exactly.
In the theological reading Wilhelm is pushing, she is acting as a Christ-like intercessor. She is the mechanism of grace. The absolute law demands death for the sin, but the intercessor offers a pathway to salvation.
Which perfectly sets up the climax of the narrative. The prince arrives at the end of the century. He braves the dangerous thorns, much like Christ traveling into the dangers of the mortal world to raise Lazarus from the dead.
He leans down, kisses Briar Rose, and she awakens. The entire castle is brought back to life. Under Wilhelm's editorial hand, a kiss isn't just a romantic trope. It is a profound Christian symbol of redemption and physical resurrection through divine love.
It really is a masterful piece of editorial engineering. You have the pagan Norns spinning an inescapable destiny, seamlessly integrated with the Christian promise of grace, mitigation, and resurrection.
It's exactly like taking an ancient, raw, pagan operating system built entirely on fate and sentient nature and forcefully installing a shiny new Christian software update over the top of it.
That's exactly it.
It runs smoother, it looks cleaner to the 19th century user, but if you look at the source code, you can still see the ancient, blood-soaked algorithms running in the background.
The syncretic blend of those two belief systems is what gives Briar Rose its lasting, universal resonance.
But if Briar Rose is the prime example of the Grimms successfully smoothing over the rough edges, we have to look at what happens when a story actively resists that sanitization.
Oh, yeah.
There are certain tales in their collection that are so inherently grotesque, so deeply embedded in a terrifying pagan logic, that no amount of Christian polish could hide the blood underneath. To truly experience the raw, terrifying power of the original merchant, we have to examine our second case study, the Juniper Tree.
The Juniper Tree, sometimes published as the almond tree depending on the translation, is widely considered by folklorists to be one of the darkest, most structurally complex, and psychologically disturbing tales in the entire Grimm canon.
It's terrifying.
In the Arne Thompson folklore classification system, it sits under type 720. My mother slew me. My father ate me.
Wait, I need to pause you right there. The Arne Thompson system. What is that, and why does the story have a specific serial number?
Right, so the Arne Thompson index is essentially the Dewey Decimal System for global folklore. Folklorists realize that the exact same narrative structures appear across entirely different cultures all over the world, so they catalog them into types. Type 720 specifically categorizes tales featuring a murdered child, a cannibalistic meal fed to an unknowing parent, and the child's subsequent reincarnation as a bird that seeks revenge.
That is so specific.
It is. And the fact that this specific hyper-violent narrative structure exists in multiple cultures independently tells us something profound about human psychology.
That is deeply unsettling. Okay, let's walk the listener through the actual plot of the Grimm version, because it plays out like an A24 psychological horror film.
It really does.
It opens with a pious couple who are desperate for a child. One winter day, the wife is standing under a magical juniper tree in her yard, peeling an apple. She cuts her finger, and her blood drops onto the white snow. Looking at the blood, she wishes for a child as white as snow and as red as blood.
We immediately see the classic fairy tale tropes here. The stark color contrast of red blood on white snow, and the deep mystical connection between nature, blood sacrifice, and birth.
Right. So she gets pregnant, and she begins compulsively eating the berries from the juniper tree. She becomes deathly ill and makes her husband promise to bury her beneath the tree when she dies. She gives birth to a beautiful boy, dies of sheer happiness, and the husband buries her roots deep in the earth under the juniper.
So far, the narrative is tragic, but beautiful. It establishes the juniper tree as a focal point of life, death, and maternal energy.
But then the husband eventually remarries, and the new stepmother is utterly consumed by malice. She deeply loves her own biological daughter, little Marlinchen, but she violently despises her stepson.
Right, the classic wicked stepmother dynamic.
She is driven by a paranoid obsession that Marlinchen must inherit the family's entire fortune. So one afternoon, she decides to eliminate the stepson. She sets a trap. She opens a massive, heavy wooden chest that stores apples and asks the boy if he wants one. When the boy leans down, placing his head inside the chest, she violently slams the heavy iron-bound lid down, instantly decapitating him.
The brutality is shocking, but the psychological horror of what she does next is even worse.
It gets so much worse.
In a panic to cover up the murder, she finds a white bandage and literally ties the boy's severed head back onto his neck. She props his lifeless body up on a chair by the front door and places an apple in his hands, staging it to look like he's just sitting there resting.
It is beyond macabre. And then her own daughter, Malenshen, comes along. She asks her brother for the apple, but of course he doesn't answer. She goes to her mother, and the stepmother tells Malenshen, if he won't answer you, box him hard in the ear.
It's so twisted.
Malenshen, being an obedient child, walks over and strikes her dead brother in the face. His severed head rolls off his shoulders and hits the floor. Malenshen is completely traumatized, weeping uncontrollably, believing she's just murdered her brother.
And this is where the tale crosses the threshold into the realm of profound taboo. The stepmother comforts her daughter, telling her they must hide the evidence. She takes the boy's body into the kitchen, hacks it to pieces, and stews him in a pot, cooking him into a thick blood soup, effectively a black pudding stew.
She cooks him for dinner, and then the oblivious father comes home from work. He sits down at the table, and she serves him the stew. He takes a bite, declares it to be the most delicious meal he has ever eaten, and continually demands more, throwing the bones under the table until he has entirely consumed his own son.
All the while, poor Marlinchen is crying under the table. She gathers her brother's discarded bones, wraps them reverently in her best silk handkerchief, and carries them outside, burying them beneath the roots of the magical juniper tree, exactly where his biological mother was buried.
This triggers the most surreal sequence in the book. A mysterious mist begins to swirl around the tree. The branches rub together, creating fire, and out of the flames, a beautiful bird emerges and flies into the sky. The boy has been reincarnated. He flies into the town square and begins singing a haunting, repetitive song to the townsfolk. My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister, little Marlinchen, gathered together all my bones, tied them in a silken handkerchief, laid them beneath the juniper tree. Kiwit, what a beautiful bird am I.
The song functions as a spell of mesmerism. He sings it to a goldsmith, a shoemaker, and a group of millers. They are so captivated by the supernatural beauty of the song that they pay the bird to sing it again.
Right, they give him gifts.
Yes. The goldsmith gives him a heavy gold chain. The shoemaker gives him a pair of red shoes. And the millers give him a massive, heavy stone millstone.
Armed with these items, the bird flies back to his house. He drops the gold chain around his father's neck as a reward. He drops the red shoes down to his weeping sister, Marlinchen. And then the stepmother, who is losing her mind with guilt, runs out the front door screaming that she feels raging fires within her arteries.
And then,
as she steps over the threshold, the bird drops the massive millstone directly onto her head, crushing her into a bloody paste instantly.
it's incredible, and in the smoke and flames of her destruction, the bird touches the ground and transforms back into the human boy. He is fully restored. He takes his father and his sister by the hand. They go inside, sit down at the table, and casually eat lunch together.
Okay, I have to stop here. What on earth is the moral of this story?
It's hard